Following weeks of uncertainty, U.S. lawmakers have formally certified Joe Biden as president. Republican Vice President Mike Pence certified the Electoral College count of 306 electors in favor of the Democrats. Outgoing Republican President Donald Trump received 232 Electoral College votes. The certification by Congress paves way for Biden to be inaugurated on the 20th of January. Now, to discuss this and the violent scenes we saw last night at the U.S. Capitol, I'm now joined by Professor Gilbert Kadyagala, Director of Wits University's African Center for the Study of the United States, and Dr. Oscar van Heerden, who is the International Relations Scholar and political commentator. Dr. van Heerden, I'll start with you. What is the significance of all that's transpired in the last 24 hours in the US of A?
Thanks, Hugo. I mean, it's simply when you look through all the fog, what it tells us is that the United States of America is a deeply divided nation at this point in history. Even though, as you know, it might have been a few thousand protesters that stormed the Capitol Hill, as you know, the elections, it was more than 70 million Americans that voted for Donald Trump, for the Republican Party. Of course, President-elect Biden, unequivocally the winner of that election, confirmed by courts of law and now by the Electoral College, which we saw was wanting to be disrupted by these Trump supporters. But it does speak to a country that is deeply divided, and the President-elect Biden is going to have a mammoth task to try and pick up the pieces that was left by the Trump administration to try and yet again bring confidence back into the democracy of the United States.
Professor Kadyagala, is this the sort of democracy that we all aspire to? Thousands of supporters going into Capitol Hill. Those scenes were catastrophic.
Yeah, it is not the kind of democracy we aspire to, but I think the big question is that it is not the kind of democracy we expect of the US, which is a long democracy, 200 years plus old. So the expectation was that these kinds of events will not happen there. But I think it's a wake-up call, therefore, to all of us to remind ourselves that all democracies are fragile. All democracies are works in progress. And we not only need the issues around institutions, but we also need people behind those institutions. I think the story of Donald Trump was, this is somebody who was elected, but he didn't have any serious democratic credentials. So this was a disaster waiting to happen. After 4 years of anti-democratic tendencies, after 4 years of entertaining extremism and intolerance, I think it was predictable that we could get to this stage as his end game, I think, as he goes out, because he didn't want to accept defeat. And that was the big problem that we saw last night, is inspiring his supporters, in fact, to storm the citadel of American democracy. So I think we need to look at it as an event that is a wake-up call on the balance between leadership and institutions. And hopefully the American people and everybody across the world who aspires to any form of democracy would learn from this, that democracy can be overthrown by mobs very quickly. But the issue is how you recover quickly also from that kind of disaster. And I think that's what we saw Congress do. It went back and certified the results.
I suppose that's a good question, which Dr. van Heerden, I'd like you to respond to, is how do the Republicans and how does the United States recover from this?
Well, the truth of the matter is that the issue cannot be overlooked. A rally took place with insurgents, people making their intentions very clear that they are going to storm Capitol Hill, as Professor Kadyagala is saying, and was egged on by the sitting president Donald Trump playing with words, keep it peaceful, but yet disrupt, and so on and so forth. And so there needs to be consequences for the actions of these individuals, including President Donald Trump, because failure to do so is going to suggest that every time you have a disagreement, you don't agree with the outcome of an election, a legitimate elections, you can simply get into your car and come and storm the Capitol Hill. And so I think that it will be a grave mistake if law enforcement authorities are not going to try and identify some of the leaders of this right-wing groups and bring them to book. And I think it would be a mistake if nothing at all is going to happen with the outgoing Donald Trump, who clearly incited this violence, which led to the death of 4 American citizens, and so and plenty more others, obviously injured and so forth. So I think that if the Republicans and if indeed those advocates of democracy wants to ensure that people have a sense of respect and a sense of legitimacy for the democracy within the United States, they simply have to bring people to book, and some people must go to jail.
So, Professor, it's not enough to just have blocked Donald Trump's Twitter account. What else can Senate do?
There are many things that it needs to do. The first thing, as I said, is for return to civility, the return to dignity, but also the return to consensus building, which has been the hallmark of American democracy. And Oscar is correct that the US society is more polarized than it has ever been before. So, but the way to resolve polarization is to return to the center. How do you talk to each other? How do the Democrats and the Republicans speak to each other in more civil ways? And this has always happened. So I think the Trump phenomenon is an aberration in a way, because we had somebody who was very, very much on the extreme, but fortunately being elected. And when he got elected, then he used the office of the presidency really to create more division. So I think it's a very simple question of a return to some sense of normalcy, which involves civil discussion, civil debates, but also acknowledgement of differences, which I think is also another key element of US democracy. And I think the Americans have always shown that they are a resilient society and they can recover very quickly from these kinds of crises. And I think that is the expectation of the Biden administration as he begins to talk about unity and returning to some semblance of normalcy that is involved in recreation of an order that everybody understands as US democracy. But it's very difficult and it will take time because the genie is out. I mean, you have the extremists on the streets, and so you still have to convince them to go back home peacefully.
Now, Doc, just to pick a page there from what Professor said, there are obviously issues that need to be addressed in America, but what about further afield? The Americans, the US to a very large extent, have been the prefects of democracy, particularly where the continent and certainly certain states in Asia is concerned. Will they still have the same sort of power or influence when it comes to democracy?
In fact, Hugo, at times even talking of exporting democracy to the Middle East and to Africa and other parts of the world. Indeed, that now lies in crisis. I think the legitimacy of the United States is in question. World leaders are looking with dismay at what happened over the last 12 hours. And indeed, President-elect will have to take time to rebuild that reputation for which we know the United States to be. It will be very difficult indeed for the US administration to want to stand on their moral high horse in any part of the world after this fiasco and chaos that we've seen in Washington and throughout this election. So it is a work in progress. Biden will have to do much to try and repair that status. But as some and others have said, Joe Biden does have a very long history of foreign policy. He's been involved in that international arena for a very long time. And I think that he knows that he has a very difficult job ahead, but he's up for the task, I would imagine, to try and regain some of the legitimacy that the US had prior to this unfortunate set of events. The other thing I want to mention, Hugo, is that we had a similar incident in South Africa when our democracy was still taking shape, where right-wing groups just stormed the World Trade Organization, World Trade Center at the then Jan Smuts International Airport, where legislators also had to run helter-skelter and hide under tables and so forth. And the point is that out of that incident, because it was such a direct threat to our young democracy, it resulted, among other things, it resulted in the 1994 breakthrough and the general election. And let us hope that this particular lesson in Washington, D.C. will also result in very major changes within the U.S. system.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. That was Professor Gilbert Kadyagala, Director of Wits University's African Center for the Study of the United States, and Dr. Oscar van Heerden, who is the International Relations Scholar and political commentator. And we were just talking about the United States and all that's transpired at Capitol Hill in the last 24 hours.